Jake Miller stepped off the transport shuttle and felt his stomach drop. The space station was huge, bigger than anything he had ever seen back on Earth. Metal walls stretched in every direction, and strange lights blinked in patterns he did not understand. The air smelled different too, like electricity and something sweet he could not name. He pulled his old duffel bag closer to his chest and made sure. His grandmother's blanket was still tucked safely inside. The blanket was thick and heavy, made from soft wool in colors of blue and green. His grandmother had spent months making it for him before he left Earth. She said it would keep him warm no matter where he went in the galaxy. Other students moved around him in the docking bay. Most of them were not human. Jake had seen pictures and videos during his training, but seeing real aliens up close was different. A group of tall, thin beings with silver skin walked past him, their long necks turning to look at him with curious eyes. Near the wall, something that looked like a walking tree was talking to a creature covered in bright orange fur. Jake found his room number on a small device. They had given him room 247 in the student housing section. He started walking down a long hallway, following signs written in 20 different languages. At least one of them was English. The door to room 247 slid open with a soft hiss. Inside, Jake found his roommate already unpacking. The alien was tall, maybe 7 feet, with blue scales covering his body. He had 4 arms instead of 2, and his head was longer than a human head. When he saw Jake, he made a sound like clicking and whistling. A small device on the alien's chest spoke in English. "Greetings, roommate. I am Zeth of the Valian people. You must be the human student." Jake nodded and set his bag down on the empty bed. "I'm Jake Miller from Earth." Zeth's forearms moved quickly as he arranged his belongings. "I have heard much about humans. Your species is very young compared to most others in the Academy. Only a few thousand years of recorded history, yes." "Something like that," Jake said. He opened his bag and started taking out his clothes. When he pulled out his grandmother's blanket, Zeth stopped what he was doing. "What is that covering?" Zeth asked. His translator made his voice sound curious, but also amused. "It's a blanket. My grandmother made it for me." Zeth moved closer with 2 of his arms still unpacking. "A blanket? Yes, I have read about these. Humans use fabric coverings to regulate body temperature." "How primitive." Jake felt his face grow warm. "It works fine. Of course, I meant no offense. It is simply that most species have evolved past the need for such tools. Valians have internal bioregulators that keep our body temperature perfect at all times." Zeth touched a spot on his neck where Jake could see a small bump under the scales. Very efficient system. Before Jake could respond, 2 more aliens entered the room. The first one looked like it was made of living crystal. Light seemed to move through its body in slow waves of color. The second alien was covered in thick, dark fur and walked on 4 legs like a large dog, but its front legs ended in hands instead of paws. "Ah, my friends," Zeth said. "This is Jake, the human student I told you about. Jake, meet Kira of the Silith Collective and Nox from the desert world Thermica." The crystal being's voice came from somewhere inside its body, clear like the sound of wind chimes. "Welcome, human Jake. I am Kira. We are excited to learn about your species." Nox's translator was attached to a collar around his neck. His voice sounded like a growl made into words. "Yes, humans are quite interesting. Very adaptable, despite your lack of natural advantages." Jake was not sure if that was meant to be a compliment or not. "Thanks, I guess." Kira moved closer to Jake's bed, and the light inside her body pulsed brighter. "What is that colorful fabric?" "It's just a blanket," Jake said again. He was starting to feel embarrassed about it. All 3 aliens looked at the blanket, then at each other. Zeph made that clicking sound again, and the others made their own strange noises. Jake realized they were laughing. "A blanket," Knox said, his whiskers twitching. "On Thermica, even our youngest cubs would be embarrassed to use such crude methods." For temperature control, Kira's crystals chimed softly. "Silith bodies absorb heat from our environment and redistribute it as needed. We have no need for external coverings." "Indeed," Zeth agreed. "Valian bioregulators are far more advanced than simple fabric. We can survive in temperatures that would kill most organic beings." Jake folded his blanket carefully and placed it at the foot of his bed. He had learned long ago that sometimes it was better to stay quiet when people were making fun of him. His grandmother had taught him that actions spoke louder than words. "Tell me, Jake," Zeth said as he finished unpacking with his 4 arms. "Working independently, what other primitive tools did humans bring to the academy?" "Just normal stuff," Jake said. "Clothes, books, personal things." "Books," Kira repeated. "Physical information storage. How quaint." "Silith memory crystal skin. Hold the knowledge of entire civilizations." Knox nodded his furry head. "Thermic knowledge is passed down through genetic memory. We are born knowing what our ancestors learned." Jake pulled out a few more items from his bag. Picture of his family, some snacks from Earth, and a small toolkit his father had given him. The aliens watched everything with interest, like they were studying animals at a zoo. "What is that collection of metal tools?" Zeph asked, pointing at the toolkit. "Just basic tools. Screwdrivers, pliers, that kind of thing." More alien laughter filled the room. "Humans still use manual tools," Knox said to the others. "No wonder. They develop so slowly." Now, Kira said, though her crystals were still chiming with amusement. "We must remember that humans are a very young species. They will learn to abandon such primitive methods in time." Jake zipped up his empty bag and slid it under his bed. "Maybe," he said quietly. The 3 aliens continued talking among themselves, sharing stories about their advanced technologies and natural abilities. Zeph's bioregulators could keep him comfortable in space without a suit. Kira's crystalline body could survive being shattered and reform itself. Knox's people could go weeks without water in the desert heat. Jake listened politely, but did not say much. His grandmother had always told him that the smartest person in the room was often the one who talked the least. She had also told him that every tool had its purpose, and every skill had its time. As the day went on, more students stopped by their room to introduce themselves. Word had spread that there was a human in the dormitory, and everyone wanted to see what Earth's representative looked like. They all seemed friendly enough, but Jake could tell they thought humans were cute rather than capable. When night came and the artificial lights dimmed to simulate Earth's day-night cycle, Jake lay in his bed listening to his roommates settle down for sleep. Zeph's bioregulators made a soft humming sound. Kira's crystals glowed faintly in the dark. Knox's breathing was deep and steady. Jake pulled his grandmother's blanket up to his chin. It smelled like home, like the little house where she had taught him to be patient, to be observant, and to never give up. He thought about all the stories she had told him about their family, about people who had survived hard times with nothing but determination and simple tools. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and probably more laughter from his alien classmates. But Jake was not worried. His grandmother had taught him something that none of these advanced species seemed to understand. Sometimes the old ways were the best ways, and sometimes the simplest solutions were the strongest ones. He closed his eyes and went to sleep, warm and comfortable under his primitive blanket. Jake had been at the academy for 2 weeks when Professor Velkoff made the announcement that would change everything. The professor was unlike any creature Jake had ever seen, even after meeting dozens of alien species. She stood 8 feet, tall on 6 legs, with a body that looked like a giant ant covered in dark green armor. Her head had compound eyes that seemed to look in all directions at once, and when she spoke, her mouth parts clicked and moved in ways that made Jake feel dizzy. The classroom was full of students from 20 different worlds. Jake sat in the eye, back row next to his roommate Zeth, who was using 2 of his arms to take notes, while his other 2 arms adjusted his bioregulator settings. Kira sat nearby, her crystal body glowing softly as she absorbed light from the room's heating elements. Nox had curled up in his chair like a large cat, but his ears were pointed forward, listening carefully. Professor Velkoth's mandibles clicked as she began to speak. Her voice came through the universal translators as a series of sharp, precise words. Students, today I will announce the most challenging course offered at this academy. Survival tactics is not required, but those who complete it successfully will earn recognition throughout the galaxy. A murmur of excitement went through the classroom. Jake had heard older students talking about survival tactics in whispers. Some called it impossible. Others said it was the best way to prove your species was truly advanced. The course takes place on Hoth 7, the frozen moon of a dead star system, Professor Velkoth continued. You will be tested under gradually worsening conditions over the course of 7 standard days. The exercise begins in comfortable temperatures and becomes more challenging as time passes. Zeth leaned over to Jake and whispered through his translator. This should be simple for advanced species like mine. Valian bioregulators can handle extreme temperatures easily. Professor Velkoth's compound eyes seemed to focus on their section of the room. The purpose of this exercise is to test your species' natural adaptability and survival instincts. You will face challenges that push your biological systems to their limits. Kira's crystals chimed softly with confidence. Silith thermal regulation is among the most advanced in the known galaxy, she said to the students around her. This course was designed for species like ours. The professor raised one of her front legs for silence. Each student may bring one personal item for comfort during the exercise. Choose this item wisely, as it will be the only non-essential equipment you are allowed. Jake felt dozens of eyes turn toward him. Word had spread through the academy about the human student, who carried around an old blanket. Many of the alien students had come to see it as a symbol of how primitive his species was. The human will probably bring his security blanket, whispered a snake-like student named Yara. Her scales changed color when she was amused, and right now they were shifting to bright yellow. More whispers and strange alien sounds of laughter rippled through the classroom. Jake kept his eyes focused on Professor Velkoth, but he could feel his face getting warm with embarrassment. Silence, Professor Velkoth clicked sharply. This course has broken many students who thought their natural advantages made them superior. Overconfidence is often the first step toward failure. When class ended, Jake walked back to his dormitory with Zeth, Kira, and Nox. The aliens were already planning what they would bring to Hoth 7. I will take my meditation crystal, Zeth announced. As they entered their room, it enhances my bioregulator efficiency by 30%. With that boost, I could survive in the vacuum of space. Kira's body pulsed with different colors as she considered her options. My thermal amplifier will allow me to absorb heat from sources other students cannot even detect. Even the faintest warmth from distant stars will be enough to keep me powered. Nox stretched out on his bed and began grooming his thick fur with one paw. I will bring cooling gel from Thermica. It prevents overheating when my fur becomes too insulated. Perfect temperature control. All 3 aliens looked at Jake expectantly. He was sitting on his bed, running his hand over the surface of his grandmother's blanket. What about you, Jake? Zeth asked with obvious amusement in his voice. Will you bring your primitive comfort blanket to the frozen moon? Jake nodded simply. Yes. A room erupted in alien laughter. Zeph's bioregulators hummed with what Jake had learned was excitement. Kira's crystals chimed like bells. Nox made a sound like barking mixed with purring. "Oh, this is perfect," Yara said as she slithered into their room with several other students behind her. "The human is going to take a blanket to survival training." More students crowded into the doorway to hear the news. Soon the hallway was full of aliens from a dozen different species, all wanting to see what the strange human would do. "A blanket," repeated a floating gas being, whose name Jake could not pronounce. "On a frozen moon where temperatures will drop below the freezing point of most atmosphere. Humans must have very different ideas about survival than the rest of us," said a student who looked like a walking pile of rocks. "On my world, we would consider such dependence on external tools to be a sign of weakness." Jake stood up from his bed and walked to his small desk. He opened a notebook and began writing down a list of things he would need to prepare for the course. The aliens continued talking and laughing behind him, but he had learned to tune out their mockery. "What are you writing, human?" Nox asked, jumping down from his bed to look over Jake's shoulder. "Just making a list," Jake said quietly. Nox read the items Jake was writing down. "Extra socks, thermal underwear, waterproof boots, hand warmers." The alien's whiskers twitched with amusement. "You plan to solve an advanced survival course with clothing." "Among other things," Jake said. Zeph moved closer with his forearms crossed. "Jake, you must understand that this course is designed to test biological adaptation, not primitive tool use. The professors want to see how well your species can survive using only what evolution gave you." Jake looked up from his notebook. What evolution gave humans was the ability to make tools and plan ahead. That's how we survived on Earth for thousands of years. "But surely you see how limited that makes you," Kira said, her crystals pulsing with what Jake had learned was concern. "Other species evolved internal solutions to environmental challenges. Humans remain dependent on external objects." "Maybe," Jake said, turning back to his list. The crowd of alien students began to disperse, still talking and laughing about the human who thought a blanket would help him survive in space. Jake heard fragments of their conversations as they left. His species will never advance beyond tool dependence. Primitive solutions for primitive minds. I almost feel sorry for him. When the room was finally quiet again, Jake continued working on his preparations. He researched the climate patterns on Hoth 7, studied the layout of the survival base camp, and read reports from previous students who had taken the course. Zeph watched him with curiosity. "You are taking this very seriously for someone who plans to rely on a simple blanket." Jake smiled, but did not look up from his research. "My grandmother always said that preparation was the most important part of any journey." "Your grandmother again," Nox said with amusement. "You talk about her often." "She raised me," Jake explained. "Taught me everything I know about surviving in difficult situations." "What could an elderly human possibly teach you about survival?" "That millions of years of evolution could not teach our species," Kira asked. Jake finally looked up from his notebook. "She taught me that survival is not about having the best equipment or the most advanced biology. It's about understanding your environment, using what you have available, and never giving up." The three aliens exchanged glances. Jake could tell. They thought his grandmother's wisdom was as primitive as his blanket. "We shall see," Zeph said diplomatically. "The course begins in 5 days. Perhaps your human methods will prove more effective than they appear." Jake went back to his preparations. He contacted his family on Earth and asked them to send additional supplies. He studied the dietary requirements for extended cold exposure. He even researched the other species who would be taking the course, learning about their biological advantages and potential weaknesses. His alien roommates spent their time very differently. They meditated to enhance their natural abilities, calibrated their biological systems, and practiced using their species' special survival techniques. On the night before they were scheduled to depart for Hoth 7, Jake packed his bag carefully. He folded his grandmother's blanket and placed it on top of everything else. The wool was soft and thick, and it still smelled like her house back on Earth. Zeph watched him pack with something that might have been respect. "You are not what I expected when I first met a human," he said. "What did you expect?" Jake asked. "Someone more like us, I suppose. Someone who would try to prove that humans could be as advanced as other species." Jake zipped up his bag and sat it by the door. "Maybe we are advanced, just in a different way." The next morning, they boarded a transport ship for Hoth 7. Jake looked out the window as they left the academy behind, watching the stars grow brighter as they moved away from the station's lights dot in a few hours. He would find out if his grandmother's blanket and her simple wisdom could stand up to the most advanced survival techniques in the galaxy. The transport ship landed on Hoth 7 with a heavy thud that Jake felt through the metal floor. When the doors opened, cold air rushed in like a living thing trying to get inside his lungs. Jake pulled his jacket tighter and picked up his bag, making sure his grandmother's blanket was secure inside. The landscape outside looked like something from a nightmare. Everything was white and gray, stretching endlessly in all directions. Ice-covered rocks that looked sharp enough to cut skin. And the wind made sounds like screaming. In the distance, Jake could see the Academy's base camp, a collection of small metal buildings connected by covered walkways. Professor Velkoff led the group of 25 students across the frozen ground. Her 6 legs moved easily over the ice, and her compound eyes scanned the area constantly. "Welcome to Hoth 7, she announced through the universal translators. "This moon has no atmosphere to speak of, so you will remain within the protected base camp area. However, the cold here can kill most organic life forms in minutes." Jake looked around at his fellow students. The alien species all seemed comfortable despite the freezing temperature. Zeph's bioregulators were humming softly, keeping his blue scales at the perfect temperature. Kira's crystal body was glowing brighter than usual, absorbing every bit of available heat. Nox's thick fur showed no signs of frost, and his breathing was steady and calm. The human student was the only one whose breath came out in white puffs that hung in the air like small clouds. "Each student will be assigned an individual survival pod," Professor Velkoff continued as they reached the base camp. "These pods provide basic shelter, but no heating or cooling systems. You must regulate your own temperature using your natural abilities and your chosen personal item." The survival pods were small metal rooms with a single bed, a desk, and a tiny window. Jake's pod was number 17, located near the edge of the camp. When he opened the door, cold air hit him like a physical blow. The metal walls were already covered with a thin layer of frost. Jake unpacked his bag quickly, his fingers starting to feel numb. He put on an extra layer of clothing and wrapped his grandmother's blanket around his shoulders. The wool felt warm and comforting against the bitter cold. Outside his window, he could see other students setting up in their own pods. Zeph was moving around his room in just his normal clothes, his bioregulators keeping him perfectly comfortable. Kira had placed her thermal amplifier in the center of her pod, and warm light was already filling the space. Nox was lying on his bed without any coverings at all, his natural fur providing all the insulation he needed. Professor Velkoff's voice came through speakers in each pod. "Day 1 begins now. The current temperature is 15 degrees Celsius. You will complete a series of physical and mental challenges over the next 8 hours. Report to the main building in 10 minutes. Jake left his pod and joined the other students, walking toward the largest building in the camp. The alien students moved with confidence and ease. Several of them were talking and laughing, treating the exercise like a fun game rather than a serious challenge. "This temperature is actually quite pleasant," Yara said, her scales showing comfortable green colors. "On my home world, this would be considered cool, but not cold." A student who looked like a walking tree nodded his branches. "In agreement. My species evolved in ice caves much colder than this. 15 degrees feels almost tropical." Jake kept quiet and focused on staying warm. His grandmother had taught him that the first rule of survival was to conserve energy and stay alert. Talking and bragging used up energy that might be needed. Later, the first day's challenges were designed to test basic survival skills. Students had to navigate through an obstacle course made of ice blocks, solve puzzles while wearing thick gloves, and build temporary shelters using only materials they could find around the camp. The alien students excelled at every task. Their advanced biology gave them advantages that made the challenges seem easy. Zeth's 4 arms allowed him to build shelters twice as fast as anyone else. Kira's crystal body could see heat signatures, making navigation simple, even in the blowing snow. Nox's enhanced senses could detect safe paths through the ice obstacles without even trying. Jake completed each challenge methodically and carefully. He was not the fastest or the strongest, but he finished every task without making mistakes. When other students used their natural advantages to rush through the obstacles, Jake took his time to understand each challenge before attempting it. During the lunch break, Jake sat alone at a table in the main building, eating heated rations, while his grandmother's blanket draped over his shoulders. The alien students gathered in groups, discussing how easy the first day had been. "I barely needed to activate my secondary thermal systems," Zeth told his friends. "My primary bioregulators are handling this temperature without any strain." Kira's crystals chimed with amusement. "I have absorbed so much heat from the environment that I could probably warm this entire building if needed." Nox stretched out on the floor like a large, comfortable pet. "My fur is designed for desert heat, but it insulates just as well against cold. I could sleep outside tonight without any discomfort." Several students looked over at Jake, sitting by himself with his primitive blanket. Whispers and alien laughter followed their glances. "Look at the human," said a floating gas being. "Already bundled up like he is freezing to death, and the temperature has barely dropped." "Humans must be incredibly fragile," added a student whose body looked like living metal. "How did such a weak species ever survive long enough to develop?" Space travel. Jake finished his meal and returned to his pod for the afternoon challenges. Professor Velkoth had announced that they would be tested on resource gathering, equipment maintenance, and emergency response procedures. The resource gathering task required students to collect ice samples from different areas around the camp and analyze them for purity and mineral content. Jake wrapped his blanket tighter and set out across the frozen landscape with his collection kit. The wind had picked up since morning, and snow was starting to fall in small, sharp crystals that stung when they hit exposed skin. Jake pulled his hood up and kept his head down, focusing on the task at hand. Other students moved across the ice with ease. Their biological advantages protected them from the wind and cold, allowing them to work quickly and efficiently. Jake moved more slowly, but he was thorough in his work, carefully labeling each sample and recording detailed notes about where he found it. By the end of the first day, Jake had completed all the required tasks successfully. He was not the top performer in any category, but he had not failed any challenges either. More importantly, he felt good physically, despite the cold temperature and demanding schedule. That evening, students gathered in the main building for dinner and social time. The alien species compared their performance and discussed their strategies for the coming days. "Tomorrow the temperature drops to 5 degrees, Zeth announced, reading from the schedule. "Still well within normal parameters for Valian biology. My thermal amplifier has stored enough heat today to last through several days of colder weather. Kira added confidently. Jake listened to their conversations while eating his dinner. His grandmother's blanket was draped over his chair, and he noticed that several alien students kept looking at it with expressions that seemed like curiosity mixed with pity. "How are you feeling, Jake?" asked Knox, his translator making his growling voice sound almost concerned. "This must be quite challenging for a species with no natural cold resistance." Jake smiled and took another bite of his heated rations. "I am doing fine. Just taking it one day at a time." "Admirable attitude," said Professor Velkov, who had been listening from nearby. "Though I wonder how long such determination can substitute for biological adaptation." After dinner, Jake returned to his pod and prepared for the night. The temperature outside had dropped even further, and frost was forming on the inside of his small window. He arranged his blanket carefully on his bed and settled in for sleep. Through the thin walls, he could hear other students moving around comfortably in their pods. Some were still awake and talking, completely unaffected by the cold that was making Jake's breath visible even inside his shelter. Jake pulled his grandmother's blanket up to his chin and thought about home. He remembered winter camping trips with his father, ice fishing with his grandfather, and long walks through snow-covered forests with his grandmother. His family had taught him that humans might not have the best natural equipment for every situation, but they had something else that was just as valuable. They had the ability to adapt, to learn, and to find ways to survive using whatever tools were available. His grandmother's blanket was more than just a piece of fabric. It represented thousands of years of human knowledge about staying warm, staying alive, and never giving up. As Jake drifted off to sleep, warm and comfortable under his simple wool blanket, he wondered what his alien classmates would think when the real cold began. Jake woke up on the 5th day to the sound of wind howling outside his pod like a living thing trying to break in. When he looked out his small window, everything was white. Snow was falling so hard that he could barely see the other pods just a few meters away. The metal walls of his shelter were covered in thick frost, and his breath came out in clouds so dense it looked like fog. The temperature had dropped to minus 40 degrees Celsius overnight. For the first time since arriving on Hoth 7, Jake could feel the cold trying to get through all his layers of clothing. He pulled his grandmother's blanket tighter around his shoulders and began his morning routine of checking his equipment and preparing for the day's challenges. Outside, he could hear sounds that had not been there on previous days. Metal creaking and groaning as it contracted in the extreme cold. The sharp crack of ice forming on surfaces that had been clear the night before. Most concerning of all, he could hear voices from other pods, alien voices that sounded strained and uncomfortable for the first time since the exercise began. Jake dressed carefully, putting on every layer of clothing he had brought. Thermal underwear, regular clothes, insulated jacket, waterproof outer shell, thick gloves, warm hat, and finally his grandmother's blanket wrapped around everything like a cape. He looked like a walking pile of fabric, but he was warm and ready to face whatever the day would bring. When he stepped outside his pod, the cold hit him like a physical blow. The air was so frigid that it hurt to breathe, and each step on the frozen ground made crunching sounds that echoed off the metal buildings. Jake moved carefully toward the main building, keeping his head down and his blanket pulled tight. Other students were also making their way to the morning briefing, but they looked very different than they had on previous days. Zeph was walking slowly, his forearms wrapped around his body, and Jake could hear his bioregulators working harder than ever before. The soft humming sound had become a loud whirring noise, like a machine running at maximum capacity. Kira was moving even more slowly than Zeph. Her crystal body, which had been glowing brightly for the first 4 days, was now dim and flickering. The thermal amplifier she carried was working constantly, but it no longer seemed to be keeping up with the heat loss from her crystalline structure. Nox was perhaps the most shocking sight of all. The alien's thick fur, which had looked so perfect for cold weather, was now covered with white frost. Ice crystals clung to every hair, and Jake could see that the fur around Nox's mouth and nose had frozen into solid chunks. The four-legged alien was shivering, something Jake had never seen him do before. Inside the main building, Professor Velkoff was waiting with the day's instructions. Her compound eyes scanned the group of students, and Jake could tell she was noting the changes in their condition. Several aliens who had been energetic and confident just yesterday now looked tired and stressed. Day 5 presents new challenges, the professor announced through the universal translators. The temperature will continue to drop throughout the day, reaching -50 degrees by evening. Today's tasks will test your ability to maintain complex problem-solving skills under extreme environmental stress. A murmur of concern went through the group of alien students. For the first time, Jake heard doubt in their voices instead of confidence. "Are the heating systems at our pods functioning correctly?" asked Yara, her scales now showing colors Jake had never seen before, dull grays and blues that suggested distress. "The pods provide only basic shelter," Professor Velkoff replied. "Temperature regulation remains your responsibility." Jake noticed that he was the only student who did not look worried by this announcement. His preparation and layered clothing system were working exactly as designed. His grandmother had taught him that surviving cold weather was not about fighting the environment, but about working with it, using proper insulation and maintaining body heat through activity and proper nutrition. The first challenge of the day involved repairing damaged communication equipment while working outside in the wind and snow. Students had to disassemble complex electronic devices, identify faulty components, and rebuild the systems using tools that became increasingly difficult to handle as temperatures dropped. Jake watched as his alien classmates struggled with tasks that would have been simple for them in warmer conditions. Zeth's 4 arms, usually a huge advantage, were now clumsy and slow as his bioregulators diverted energy away from fine motor control to focus on keeping his core body temperature stable. Kira's crystalline fingers, which could normally manipulate the smallest components with perfect precision, were now brittle and unresponsive in the extreme cold. Nox tried to use his enhanced senses to diagnose equipment problems, but his frozen whiskers and ice-covered nose had lost much of their sensitivity. The thick fur that had seemed like perfect insulation was now working against him, trapping moisture that froze and made movement difficult. Jake worked methodically through the repair tasks, his gloved hands moving steadily even though the tools were cold enough to burn skin through the insulation. His grandmother's blanket provided an extra layer of warmth around his shoulders, and more importantly, it gave him confidence and comfort in the harsh environment. "How is the human still functioning normally?" Jake heard one student whisper to another as they struggled with a frozen circuit board. "His species must be more cold adapted than we thought," came the reply, but Jake knew that was not the truth. Humans were not naturally adapted to extreme cold any more than most other species. The difference was that humans had learned to survive by using tools, planning ahead, and never giving up when conditions became difficult. His grandmother had taught him that survival was not about being the strongest or having the best natural advantages. It was about being smart, being prepared, and helping others when they needed it. During the lunch break, Jake noticed that several alien students were having serious problems. A tree-like student named Branch had developed ice formations on his bark that were preventing him from moving his limbs properly. A floating gas being called Drift was having trouble maintaining his shape in the dense, cold air. Even Professor Velkoff seemed to be moving more slowly than usual, her 6 legs working harder to maintain balance on the increasingly slippery surfaces. Jake finished his heated meal and approached Zeth, who was sitting alone at a table with his 4 arms wrapped around his torso. The Velian's bioregulators were making loud whirring sounds, and his blue scales had taken on a darker, almost purple color that Jake had never seen before. "Are you feeling okay?" Jake asked, sitting down across from his roommate. Zeph looked up with eyes that seemed glassy and unfocused. "My bioregulators are operating at maximum capacity," he said through his translator. "I have never experienced anything like this before." "Maybe I can help," Jake offered. "I have some extra hand warmers in my pack." "Hand warmers," Zeph repeated, as if the words did not make sense. Jake pulled 2 small packets from his pocket and activated them by shaking. Within seconds, they began generating heat through a simple chemical reaction. He handed them to Zeph, who held them against his body with obvious relief. "These are just basic human technology," Jake explained. "Nothing fancy, but they work." Zeph stared at the small packets with something like amazement. "Your primitive tools are more effective than my advanced biological systems." Jake shrugged. Different solutions for different problems. As the afternoon progressed, more alien students began to struggle seriously with the extreme conditions. Jake found himself helping wherever he could, sharing his simple human tools and techniques with beings who had looked down on such primitive methods just days before. He showed Kira how to wrap fabric around her crystalline extremities to prevent heat loss. He taught Nox how to break up the ice formations in his fur and keep the air spaces that provided insulation. He even helped several other students create makeshift shelters using basic materials and techniques his grandfather had taught him. During camping trips, "I do not understand," Kira said as Jake helped her wrap cloth around her crystal formations. "Why are your simple methods more effective than our advanced biological adaptations?" Jake secured the fabric carefully and stepped back to check his work. "Maybe because my species had to learn how to survive without biological advantages. We had to get creative." By evening, when the temperature had dropped to -50 degrees Celsius, the difference between Jake and his alien classmates was dramatic. The human student was still moving normally, completing tasks efficiently, and helping others stay functional. Meanwhile, beings who had seemed almost godlike in their abilities just days before were struggling to perform basic functions. That night, as Jake settled into his pod with his grandmother's blanket, he could hear distress calls coming from other shelters. Emergency heating units were being activated in several pods to prevent serious injury to students whose biological systems had failed to cope with the extreme conditions. Jake pulled his simple wool blanket up to his chin and smiled. His grandmother had been right about many things, but especially about this. The best tools were often the simplest ones, tested and improved over generations of human experience. Sometimes the old ways really were the best ways. Jake woke up on the 7th and final day to complete silence. The wind had stopped howling, the metal buildings had stopped creaking, and even the sounds of other students moving around in their pods had disappeared. When he looked out his small window, the world outside looked like a frozen wasteland from another planet. Everything was covered in thick layers of ice that sparkled like diamonds in the pale morning light. The temperature display on his pod's simple computer showed -80 degrees Celsius. Jake had never experienced cold like this before, not even during the worst winters back home on Earth. But his preparation and his grandmother's blanket had kept him warm through the night, and he felt ready to face whatever challenges the final day would bring. Jake put on his layers of clothing with the same careful routine he had followed every morning. Thermal underwear, regular clothes, insulated jacket, waterproof shell, thick gloves, warm hat, and finally his grandmother's blanket wrapped around everything like a protective shield. The wool felt soft and familiar against his shoulders, carrying with it the smell of home and the memory of his grandmother's gentle hands. When he stepped outside his pod The cold was like nothing he had ever experienced. The air was so frigid that it seemed to freeze instantly in his lungs, and each breath required conscious effort. The ground beneath his feet was covered in ice, so thick that his boots made no sound when he walked. Every surface sparkled with frost crystals that looked beautiful but deadly dot. As Jake made his way toward the main building, he began to notice that something was very wrong with the other students. Many of the pods had their emergency heating systems activated, which meant that the aliens inside were in serious danger from the extreme cold. Red warning lights blinked on several buildings, and Jake could see through windows that some students were huddled under emergency thermal blankets provided by the academy. When Jake reached the main building, he found Professor Velkoff waiting alone. The giant insect professor looked different than she had on previous days. Her movements were slower and more careful, and her compound eyes seemed to have lost some of their brightness. Even her species, which had seemed perfectly adapted to any environment, was feeling the effects of the brutal cold. "Student Jake Miller," she said through her universal translator, her mandibles clicking more slowly than usual. "You appear to be the only participant still functioning normally." Jake looked around the empty meeting room. "Where is everyone else?" "Most students are currently confined to their emergency heated pods to prevent serious biological damage," Professor Velkoff explained. "Their advanced biological systems have reached their operational limits." Through the large windows of the main building, Jake could see other students in their pods. Zeth was visible through his window, wrapped in multiple emergency thermal blankets with heating devices surrounding him. His bioregulators had shut down completely during the night, leaving him defenseless against the killing cold. Kira's crystalline body had gone completely dark, and she was connected to external heating equipment to prevent her molecular structure from fracturing. Nox was barely visible under a pile of heated blankets, his once proud fur now brittle and frozen solid. "The exercise continues," Professor Velkoff announced. "Final day challenges must still be completed by any student capable of functioning in these conditions." Jake nodded and checked the task list on his personal device. The final challenges were designed to test ultimate survival skills under the most extreme conditions the Academy could safely create. Students had to maintain the base camp's essential systems, perform emergency repairs on life support equipment, and demonstrate their ability to help other students in crisis situations. Jake spent the morning moving between different buildings. In the camp, checking heating systems, clearing ice from ventilation units, and making sure that communication equipment continued to function. The work was hard and dangerous in the extreme cold, but his layers of clothing and his grandmother's blanket kept him warm enough to think clearly and move effectively as he worked. Jake could see other students watching him through their pod windows. Aliens who had mocked his primitive tools just days before now stared with amazement as the human student moved freely through conditions that had defeated their most advanced biological systems. During the midday break, Jake visited each pod to check on his fellow students. He brought hot drinks and food from the main building, and he shared his simple human tools with anyone who needed them. Hand warmers for students whose extremities were going numb. Extra socks for those whose feet were losing feeling. Even pieces of cloth torn from his spare clothing to help others wrap vulnerable body parts. "How are you still functioning?" Zeth asked when Jake brought him hot soup. Devilian's forearms were shaking uncontrollably, and his translator was barely working in the cold. "Preparation and the right tools," Jake said simply, adjusting Zeth's emergency blankets to help trap more heat. "Your blanket," Kira managed to say through her failing crystal structure. "It is not primitive at all." Jake smiled and tucked his grandmother's blanket more securely around his shoulders. "My grandmother always said that the best technology is the kind that works when everything else fails." The afternoon brought the most challenging tasks of the entire week. Jake had to venture outside the protected base camp area to repair a communication antenna that had been damaged by the extreme weather. The work required him to climb a tall metal tower while carrying tools and replacement parts, all while exposed to winds that felt like knives made of ice dot as Jake worked high above the ground. He could see the entire base camp spread out below him. Every pod had its emergency heating system running at maximum power. Rescue vehicles were standing by in case any student needed immediate medical evacuation. The exercise had pushed every advanced species to their absolute limits and beyond. But Jake continued working steadily, his grandmother's blanket flapping in the wind like a flag of human determination. The repair work was complex and required careful attention to detail, but Jake's hands remained steady despite the cold, and his mind stayed focused on the task. When he finally climbed down from the antenna tower, Professor Velkoff was waiting for him at the base. "Remarkable," she said, her translator making her voice sound filled with wonder. "Your species has no natural advantages for this environment, yet you have outperformed beings whose evolution specifically prepared them for extreme conditions." Jake finished packing his tools and pulled his blanket tighter against a gust of wind. Humans learned a long time ago that we had to be smart instead of strong. We had to work together and use tools instead of relying on what our bodies could do naturally. "And your blanket?" Professor Velkoff asked. "What makes it so effective?" Jake ran his hand over the thick wool fabric. "It represents thousands of years of human knowledge about staying warm. My grandmother's grandmother learned these techniques from her grandmother, going back generations. Every stitch, every pattern, every choice of material was tested by people who lived or died based on whether their tools worked." As the final day came to an end, rescue shuttles arrived to evacuate students whose biological systems had failed. Jake helped carry other students to the medical transports, his simple human tools and techniques proving more valuable than the most advanced technology in the galaxy. Looked up at Jake as he was being loaded onto a medical transport. "We were wrong about humans," he said weakly. "We thought you were primitive." Jake adjusted his grandmother's blanket and smiled. "Maybe we are primitive, but sometimes primitive works better than advanced." When the transport ships finally lifted off from Hoth 7, Jake was the only student who walked aboard under his own power. His alien classmates were carried on stretchers or supported by medical equipment, their advanced biological systems defeated by conditions that a simple wool blanket and human determination had conquered. As Jake looked back at the frozen moon through the ship's window, he thought about his grandmother and all the simple wisdom she had shared with him. Sometimes the old ways really were the best ways. Sometimes the most powerful technology was the kind that had been tested by generations of people who refused to give up. And sometimes a hand-knitted blanket was worth more than all the bioregulators and thermal amplifiers in the galaxy.